Okay guys, and welcome back to the Anvil. So today we're going to be talking about intra-abdominal pressure. Okay, now it sounds like a fancy term, but it basically refers to how we utilize our core to generate spinal stability. Now, it's something that is kind of complex, particularly if you're a beginner to lifting, but it's something that we have to put right at the beginning because ultimately it will form the foundation for a lot of the big lifts that you'll be performing as you go through the course of your training career. Now, intra-abdominal pressurization just refers to the ability for your abdomen and your breathing pattern, utilizing your diaphragm to generate pressure, okay, just to stabilize your lumbar spine or pretty much your entire body. So why is it important? Well, through a process of force transfer and something known as Sherrington's law of irradiation, we can discover that every single exercise you perform is a full body movement within some degree. So we obviously have compound and we have isolation exercises, but the key distinguishing factor between the two there is how many joints are involved within the movement rather than how many muscles. It's more or less impossible to isolate a muscle in its entirety because of the process of, or rather the law of irradiation. And all this is, I use an analogy to explain it, it's basically when you contract one muscle or you focus on contracting a muscle, it's like dropping a pebble in water and there's a ripple effect. When that impulse is sent to the muscle, there is an impulse sent out to all the neighbouring muscles around it to try and contribute a little bit of force, typically within what's known as a synergistic effect, so they contribute to the movement without directly lifting the weight. So a classic example for that, just to keep it simple, would be a bicep curl. When you activate your bicep and try and curl a weight, okay, because of the impulse that's sent to that area, it will also recruit your brachialis or your brachioradialis, a couple of your forearm flexors as well as like the anterior portion of your deltoid to help lift the weight. And the same is true within all exercises. So when we look at things that are axially loaded, which is basically where we have a compressive force on the spine, either pressing down or a shear force where it's trying to bend it, like we get within the squat and the deadlift and the overhead press and so on, we see that not only is this law of irradiation incredibly important, but we also start to look into which muscles will contribute that synergistic effect. Now, before we go any further, let's just talk about what the diaphragm is and why it's so important. So, the diaphragm is a conical shaped muscle or a dome shaped muscle that sits like this when it's in a relaxed state, and it exists within your abdomen. Its primary role is to control ventilation. So when you breathe in, the muscle will contract and it will flatten itself. That draws your ribcage down, opens up your lungs and allows your body to inhale a larger volume of air. Then it relaxes, and typically within most healthy people, the process of exhalation is actually a passive one. So the elastic tissue within the body will basically compress and it will push the air out. But the diaphragm, which some people aren't aware of, actually has a dual function. Its primary role, like I said, is to be controlling ventilation, but it's also essential within core stability. And we often refer to it as the control center for a lot of the core muscles that are going on within your abdomen, and that kind of regulates what is going on. And the reason this is so important is if you are someone that presents with very, very weak abdominal muscles, okay, it's kind of a chicken and the egg scenario as to whether or not it was because you had faulty diaphragmatic breathing patterns or whether it's because your abs were weak. But either way, they kind of go hand in hand. They're two sides of the same sword, so to speak. If you have weak abdominal muscles, the diaphragm is going to temporarily neglect its breathing role to then try and stabilize at the core to protect the spine. So a classic example of this is when you perform the plank, particularly as a sedentary individual when you're first getting into exercise, when you perform the plank or other abdominal based exercises, you'll often find that you actually hold your breath, and you'll only realize, as the exercise goes on, when your face is going bright red and everything like that. Another example of this is when you are particularly loading the deeper core muscles that we'll talk about afterwards, it's really common for people to get tightness within their neck, the sternocleidomastoid muscles, and what these kind of do is pull your head forward to try and open up your airways to gain more air because your diaphragm isn't doing its primary role of controlling ventilation. The key thing is breathing is always going to be our involuntary reflex. When we look at the branches of the nervous system like we've talked about before, we have the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. Now typically, the autonomic nervous system is something that's completely beyond our control, okay? I say typically because there's a couple of people that can, through breathing practices, ironically, control certain responses of their autonomic nervous system. But for the majority of the population, this is the things that we can't necessarily control. So blinking or, breathing at a rested rate. And somatic nervous system refers to things like muscles, all the stuff I'm doing right now to communicate this. However, when we go into an exercise, okay, part of the autonomic system, or a couple of the responses that we have within that, drift over to the somatic and they become voluntary. Now, we do have an involuntary reflex in the sense of when we're placed under, exercise demand, the body will naturally increase its respiration rate and start to breathe a little bit deeper, but we can also control that ourselves. So when it comes to the diaphragm, the key thing is the involuntary reflex will always override the voluntary one. So a classic example of this is if you try and hold your breath underwater. Most people physically cannot stay under there long enough to actually result in them drowning. Their body, the involuntary reflex, the inhibitory reflex will stop that from happening and make them get up and get some air. So when we're in an exercise where we're loading the core or the abdominal muscles or the spine in general, if you don't have proper control of your diaphragm and your body can't distinguish between how to utilize your abdominal muscles and your diaphragm, then there's going to be something that's going to give. And typically, like we said, because breathing is the absolute priority, and this is why one of the reasons that we tend to see fatigue breaking down technique so much, because the diaphragm just stops working as a core stabilizer, rightfully so, and that results in this degradation of exercise technique. Really have to be aware of that the diaphragm has this dual function between controlling the core and controlling breathing. So when we're placed under a significant amount of exercise related stress, and the diaphragm obviously is torn between whether or not to prioritize breathing, which it ultimately will do, or controlling the core in terms of controlling, the core stabilization, one of two things can happen, okay? Number one, an injury. Now, typically when you look into the epidemiological studies around resistance training and around strength sports in general, a lot of injuries occur under a fatigued state, around the 3 to 5 rep mark and beyond, not actually around the 1 rep max mark, okay? Now that sounds counterintuitive, but particularly within higher level powerlifters, their ability to control over the course of that 1 rep is actually quite high. It's when fatigue starts to set in and we get that conflict between breathing and core stabilization. Number two, the second thing that can happen, and the more common one, and the one that I'm more interested in with you guys today, is we get what's called down regulation. So the body has very, very strong inhibitory reflexes, as we've just spoke about when it comes to things like holding your breath. But there are also a series of mechanisms throughout the body's physiology that prevent the body from putting itself under a significant amount of stress that will result in injury. A classic example of this is something known as the Golgi tendon organ, or the GTO, which is a small proprioceptor within the tendons that connect the muscle to the bone. When the body experiences a significant amount of tension, and this GTO experiences this amount of tension as the joint is moving through a range of motion. So let's say it's in the bicep, and there's a huge amount of weight that's pulling this down like that, okay, and the GTO senses that the tension is too high, it switches off the muscle completely, it just shuts it off, okay, and that's to prevent the tendon from being ripped off the bone. So it's just one example of an inhibitory reflex. Now, because we're performing a movement that is known as axially loaded, as we've mentioned earlier, where the spine is being loaded, and because there is so many nerves that run through that area, you can imagine, and you'd be correct, that the inhibitory reflex that surrounds that area of the body is incredibly high. Now, it's not typical that the muscle will switch off entirely in that area because there's so much going on, and that would result in you going limp as a fish and just collapsing to the ground. But what it does do is down-regulate the amount of force that those muscles can produce to prevent you from hurting yourself. So it's one of the reasons why when you get up to a certain weight in the deadlift, if this inhibitory reflex is high, you'll try and lift the weight and it just simply won't move. Okay, it won't let you get to the point of injuring itself, it will just stop. So why is this? Why is the diaphragm so important within every other system of the body, and why does it control a lot of the inhibitory reflexes? Well, interestingly enough, there was a study done, or a model that was developed known as the Panjabi model of subsystems. You can look it up, you can give it a Google, and it basically summarizes the influence of the diaphragm on several other bodily systems because of this influence it has on breathing. Now, it's not difficult to understand necessarily that if you're not breathing properly, there's a whole lot of things that can go wrong, because ventilation controls respiration, and respiration is just the exchange of gases between cells and so on, and metabolically functioning cells anyway, and that will obviously influence all of our other bodily systems. The muscles can't work efficiently if they're not getting the sufficient amount of oxygen, neither can the organs, and so on. And in a bid to try and ensure that we do get that amount of oxygen, if the diaphragm isn't working, several other systems change within the body, particularly something that everyone is familiar with, posture. Now, it's really common to see people that suffer from asthma or breathing difficulties, that they also have a posture that look kind of like this, where they're in a thoracic. They've got this thoracic rounding, so their chest is up forward, their head is pulled forward as well, so they've got this extra tension in their neck, and again, this is in a bid to try and open up those airways. So we can see that there's a lot of other systems that change if the breathing isn't necessarily the way it should be. Now, how does this translate over to exercise? We can all talk about, health and that type of thing, but how does it influence performance? Well, interestingly enough, there was a study that came out earlier on this year, towards the back end of last year, that's discovered that diaphragmatic breathing is directly correlated to thoracic spine restrictions, overhead squat performance, ankle mobility issues, and lower back pain. They did a study where they tested a series of different cohorts and they found that this was the case. So we know, like I said there, that we can get this forward head posture, but we also know that a lot of ankle mobility issues that people suffer with within the squat, so they'll do exercises like banded distractions, they'll stretch, they'll get a lot of tightness in the calves. It's also really common to have that kind of combination where people that suffer from lower back pain and weak abs, as they say, they also have really, really tight calves. Again, this is primarily can be linked back to diaphragmatic breathing. So, obviously, all of these things are problematic when it comes to things like pain and so on, but how does it influence performance? Well, we know that the squat, for an example, needs a sufficient amount of ankle mobility for you to be able to achieve the range of motion that we want, for you to be able to squat to full depth. We also know that stability, or the ability to maintain stability rather, is directly linked to three primary issues: bracing, which is what we're talking about today, rooting, which is linked to ankle mobility, and postural mechanics, which is linked to the bar being over the midline of the foot. Now, if you've got problems with your breathing, so you can't brace properly, you've got tight ankle mobility, and you can't position the bar where it needs to be, there's a problem in all three areas there, so your stability is going to be all over the place. So again, this is why breathing is absolutely essential, or breathing correctly rather. So I just want to give a quick example, because most people will be listening to this and saying, well, I breathe all right, I know what I'm doing. All I want you to do, as you're watching this video, is just take 3 really deep breaths for me. So just breathe in, now I can pretty much hazard a guess that a large majority of the people that are watching this video will have breathed exactly as I just did and breathed in a vertical manner. So their chest will have lifted, and they will have exhaled in, like I said, in a passive way. Now again, this isn't controlling the diaphragm. This actual way of breathing should be, when you breathe in, if you stick your thumbs into your stomach now, just assume a bit of a neutral posture, and as you breathe in, see what happens in this area. That is how you should breathe. Or at least that's what we would like for you to be able to do when you breathe. So why is it that we breathe in a different way? Well, I won't go into too much detail about it, but it's simple. If you think about the positions that we assume every day in society, we're in this kind of flexed position where we're compressing the diaphragm. We don't walk as much as we usually would have done. We don't perform different movements like we would have done. We're a very lazy species nowadays anyway, so we're not getting this control of our abdomen like we would have done in the past. So as over time, we develop these behaviours that result in us being a bit more sedentary, we also lose the control of the deep core musculature. Not only the diaphragm, but a couple of other muscles that we're going to talk about shortly. So we've talked about what the diaphragm is, we've talked about why it's so important. How do we fix it? I can ramble all day about the theory, but how do we fix it? So, first thing we have to do is deload the spine entirely when we try and control the diaphragm and the breathing pattern. You won't necessarily realise it, although I do move side to side when I talk, but when you're stood up, your body is naturally swaying from side to side and it's not necessarily got complete stability. Easiest way to test that is to just stand on a wobble board, and it's very, very difficult to control your body position. And again, as you are doing this and as you're controlling that position, the diaphragm is working in synergistic effects with the core to keep you upright. As soon as we lie down, and completely deload the spine, put your body in what's called the 90-90 position, it deloads the spine and it allows you to gain control of the diaphragm because it's not having to have this dual function with stabilising your core. We would put you in this deloaded position and we would practice what's known as diaphragmatic breathing drills. At the end of this video, we'll upload each of these drills in a little bit more detail so you can understand how each of them are performed. So, as we're learning how to breathe, does this mean that we don't lift? No, of course it doesn't. We still lift, we still get strong, You got to remember that you can get strong and still benefit in an inefficient way. Okay, it's just that you won't necessarily reach your optimal potential and it might not be hazard free on the way there, which is why we talk about all this stuff. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to get you strong on the way there. Whilst we're learning how to breathe, there are two major core muscles that we need to focus on: the transverse abdominis and the internal obliques. These are the muscles that we don't see, unfortunately, but they do have a very beneficial effect on your core strength and stability. So this is exercises like the dead bug, the oblique sling, forms of loaded carries, and all these different exercises that challenge internal core stability, particularly within the world of Pilates, if you've ever come across that. We increase the strength of these muscles whilst we are obviously trying to learn and integrate the breathing pattern. So we're in a position where we've learned how to breathe through the diaphragm, okay, and then we need to now integrate it into everyday kind of positions or within particularly exercise. So what do we do from there? Well, again, we progress the intensity of that drill. So we would start to introduce load, we would start to introduce complexity, and then we would work our way up into the squat position. Then we'd utilize weightlifting belts or something similar that gives you a bit of feedback, okay? And then go on to the next step, which is learning how to brace without breathing. Now, that sounds very counterintuitive, and I've just rambled on for however long talking about the importance of breathing, but ultimately to generate intra-abdominal pressure, you would have noticed that the word is pressure, not intra-abdominal breathing. Breathing is a component of it, and it's something that we focus on with absolutely everyone because it's an autonomic nervous system response. It's something that everyone does without even having too much control of it. So it's something that we're familiar with. But ultimately, to become truly, truly strong, you want to be able to brace without using your diaphragm. So what we would do there is continue to get you to integrate this breathing pattern into these exercises, okay? But then we would start to incorporate drills that will force you, and coaching cues that will force you to brace your abs without breathing. And then again from there, all we do is just gradually phase it into some of the more axially loaded exercises like squats and deadlifts. And in the real world, how important is this? Does it have to take place all the time? The answer is yes, it is very important, and yes, it has to take place all the time. If we want to stabilize your spine, reduce your injury risk, keep you pain free, okay, if you are already experiencing pain, and optimize your performance, intra-abdominal pressure is the absolute foundation. So guys, I hope the intra-abdominal pressure lecture made sense. I just have 3 questions to try and prompt a little bit of learning and make sure that you're retaining all the information, and also to start a little bit of a discussion between myself and you over what it is that intra-abdominal pressure entails. So, a little bit of a memory test for you. Okay, what are the 2 functions of the diaphragm? So the 2 main functions of the diaphragm. Question number 2, okay, are you familiar with diaphragmatic breathing in the past? Okay, and did any of this challenge a couple of the pre-existing beliefs that you had coming into this lecture? And then finally, number 3, okay, you can come back to this video at a later date, but learning intra-abdominal pressure, has it made any significant improvements on your squat, deadlift, or any other exercise that you've performed? I know myself, when I first learned it and properly integrated it into movement, I gained a good 20 kilos on my squat within 1 session, okay? So, final questions, like I said, is number 1, what are the primary roles of the diaphragm? There's 2 of them, 2 primary roles. Number 2, were you already aware of diaphragmatic breathing patterns, and did it challenge any of your pre-existing knowledge around the area? And number 3, have you incorporated intra-abdominal pressure based movement within different exercises, and did it make any significant improvements?